I'm Deborah Crone, Professor of Early Modern Cultural History and Chair of Academic Programs here. And on behalf of our Director, Susan Weber, and my colleague, Aaron Glass, Associate Chair for Research Programs, I'm pleased to welcome you to the second of this spring's Leon Levy Foundation Lectures in Jewish Material Culture. Here at Bard Graduate Center, we study the human past and cultural history through their material traces and the complex ways in which decorative arts, design, and material culture mediate our own relationships with the past in the present. Our students, faculty, staff, and research fellows do this work cognizant of our own location in time and space. We're situated in 3 landmark buildings on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, in the heart of Lenape-Hoking. The ancestral territories of the Lenni Lenape were 1 block away from the former site of Seneca Village, a community of African American and immigrant property owners who were forcibly relocated to create Central Park. We're in a neighborhood in a city long comprised of global migrants and refugees from war, violence, and economic dislocation. We gather to hear about Jewish material culture at a precarious moment in Jewish and in human history, a distressing time of ongoing war and fragile ceasefires in Israel, Gaza, and Lebanon, not to mention Ukraine and other parts of the world, in a time of rising anti-Semitic, anti-Islamic, and anti-immigrant sentiments, a time of global political realignments and persistent climate crisis, a time of newly embattled calls for diversifying and decolonizing our academies, our museums, and our cultural institutions. It's precisely at such times that insights from the collective past, the material traces of prodigious learning, insight, and creativity are called upon to guide us out of our current predicaments into a common human future. As we'll hear tonight, museums can be key sites for mobilizing objects from the past in order to secure collective memories, to help historical traumas, and to imagine possible tomorrows. In this spirit, we're grateful to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this lecture series in Jewish material culture, which over the past 8 years has supported distinguished scholars to give 3 related lectures and then to publish with us on topics related to Jewish households, diasporas, and archaeologies ranging from the Roman Empire through the medieval Islamic world to 19th century New York and 20th century Warsaw and Israel. I'm honored tonight to introduce the distinguished speaker, Dr. Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett, who is Professor Emerita of Performance Studies at New York University and a specialist in a variety of disparate areas which don't necessarily fit together, but that's the beauty of it. Jewish studies, museum studies, folklore, tourism, and heritage studies, and food studies. A prodigious scholar, the recipient of countless awards and fellowships, a fixture on global editorial boards and advisory committees, and an internationally recognized museum consultant. She's currently the Ronald S. Lauder Chief Curator of the core exhibition at POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. Just a few book titles suggest the range of her output. Image Before My Eyes, A Photographic History of Jewish Life in Poland. Anne Frank Unbound, Media, Imagination, Memory. The Art of Being Jewish in Modern Times, and Museum Frictions, Public Cultures, Global Transformations. In his introduction to the first of this series last month, Aaron mentioned the book he found most inspiring. That was her 1998 volume, Destination Culture, Tourism, Museums, and Heritage. It is striking that the same book was also deeply influential for me, though Aaron's a museum anthropologist and my field is early modern Europe. I put it on my syllabus for a class on the social and cultural history of museums after hearing a talk she delivered at BGC in 2003, and despite a frantic search through my emails for the title of this talk, I could not find it, so we'll get back to you on that. It's a testament to BKG's synthetic genius that this book could be valued by scholars coming from such diverse realms of inquiry. Reading the essay in this text entitled The Ethnographic Object, it became clear to me that in many ways, all objects are ethnographic to someone. even Italian Renaissance cassoni. And to understand them, it's necessary to put critical distance between oneself and the material before moving in closer for a more nuanced interpretation of heritage and the ways that museums and collections reflect broader cultural tropes. I'll also add on a more personal note that my work in the field of food studies is also very much inspired by BKG's creative work in the nexus between food and performance. The title of this three-part series is Materializing History, the Making of POLIN Museum's core exhibition, and this evening is the second installment, Materializing the Past. Please join me in welcoming Barbara to the podium.
Thank you very much, Deborah. And I again thank Erin for inviting me to give this series of lectures and Andrew for making everything run so smoothly. And I also want to acknowledge the presence of several members of the board of the American Friends of POLIN Museum. And I really am so appreciative that you have come to hear this lecture. So this time, what I'd like to do is I'd like to begin with a recap, and then I want to move directly into the topic tonight. So my first message is that this museum has just celebrated its 10th anniversary. That was last year, 2024, and we have now entered our next decade. And what the next decade will bring, I hope, will be as fruitful, as exciting, and as path-breaking as our first decade. And as those of you who were here last time know, we began this project without a collection, without a building, without any infrastructure. We built it literally on the rubble of the former Jewish neighborhood and the former Warsaw Ghetto, which after the Germans had put down the uprising, they leveled it and it became an ocean of rubble. And so this museum, in a sense, made a virtue of necessity. And that is to say, it was created from the inside out. That its single greatest asset was the story, and the story then became the basis for developing the exhibition, even without a building, even without knowing what the architecture would be. And it was only with that in hand, with a master plan that was developed for the exhibition, that was its calling card to then gain the support that was necessary to actually found the museum and hold the international architectural competition, and in fact know what the building would be. So until 1993, when the idea arose, and until 2013, when the building opened, and 2014, when we had our grand opening, really the only significant marker that there had been a large, flourishing Jewish community in Warsaw, which in a sense was a symbol of a large, flourishing Jewish community in Poland, was the monument to the Ghetto Heroes. And this is a monument that was unveiled on the 5th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And you can see that it's being unveiled actually on the rubble, on a heap of rubble. And in the years that followed, the rubble was cleared, and then the museum itself was created on this very spot, the very spot where the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising broke out, and it faces the monument, and it complements the monument. We go to the monument to remember those who died by remembering how they died, and we honor their memory at the museum by remembering how they lived. Now, as I said, we created the museum from the inside out, and we began without knowing what the space would be. And we worked with a design company in London called Event Communications, and they developed a plan. And one of the first things that we did as a team, once the competition for the architecture was done, and this would have been by April 2006, the first thing we did after we assembled the team of scholars, curators, and also the design team, the first thing we did was to look at what was the overall scheme that Event Communication had proposed. And the overall scheme was that there would be a European historical timeline along one axis. There would be trans-historical thematic galleries along another axis, and that the whole 1,000-year history would be organized around a series of turning points. And we rejected it. That was the first step. Now, why? Why? And this will bear on my focus this evening, which is going to be about the Gwoździec Wooden Synagogue, but we'll get there in just a moment. So why do we reject it? First of all, we did not want to treat these histories as separate. We didn't want to treat the European historical timeline as somehow or other something independent of a history of Polish Jews. And we didn't want to treat the history of Polish Jews as somehow or other independent of the history of Poland. In other words, we rejected what I called a contextual approach, which is that there's some kind of context, and then, in a sense, the history of Polish Jews becomes a footnote to Polish history, to European history. So we said, no, we're going to create an integral history of Polish Jews, and there aren't going to be these separate historical lines that are, quote, contextual. The second is that we rejected the idea of transhistorical treatment of topics. The wedding, Jewish holidays, Hasidism, women, whatever it might be. And we chose rather to make all those topics integral to the historical flow. And so that was the first step. And then lastly, we said history, and our historians constantly reminded us of this, history is not organized as a series of turning points. There are slow processes, faster processes, but there aren't, the designers loved turning points because it gave them a very simple way of structuring the galleries. They could say, okay, up to this point, there was the Khmelnytsky uprising in the mid 18th century, turning point. There was a war, turning point. And we said, no turning points. So we had to find some other way to structure this history. So we came, and of course, as we worked, and to be fair, I think the designers, when they created the master plan, and this was the master plan, that the designers, they were working really handicapped. They didn't have that much material to work with. They didn't have a building. They didn't have a defined space. But once we had the building and we had the defined space, and that space is essentially the footprint of the building, they then proceeded to create this plan. And in essence, the plan is in this rectangular footprint, and it takes the visitor doesn't realize it because you're deep inside the exhibition, but essentially you're moving it kind of in a circle, and you end up where you began. Now, in this plan, I think you can see a raised area at the top, and that is where eventually this synagogue went. But for those of you who were not here last time, a very, very quick walkthrough of the main gallery so that you understand where is the gallery in which the synagogue appears, and why does it appear in the way that it does where it does. So we move from I would say, the priming experience of the forest into the medieval gallery. And from the medieval gallery, we move into the period of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which we divided into two parts. The one part is up to the mid-17th century, and the second part is basically the 18th century. And it's in the 18th century part that we create basically what we refer to as, quote, the Jewish town, and we refrain from the S word. The S word is shtetl. So everybody's expecting shtetl, and they're expecting the word. It's a Yiddish word. When it appears in English, it works very differently from the way it appears actually also in Polish, but they don't say shtetl, they say miasteczko. But in any event, when it appears in English, it means Fiddler on the Roof, it means Shalom Aleichem, parrots, mandala, and it means every trope and stereotype you can imagine. And that's what we wanted to avoid. So in order to avoid it, we took the topic of what we call the Jewish town, and we placed it in the 18th century, before Shalom Aleichem was alive, and where you least expect it, and where you don't necessarily immediately associate it with Fiddler on the Roof. And what is it? What it is the most characteristic form of Jewish settlement in the region, not only in Poland, but also Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, Latvia. In that whole East European area, it is a distinctive form of Jewish settlement. More than half the Jewish population in that entire area were living in towns, and a large percentage of the other 50% were living in cities. So the Jews are essentially urban. Now, what made these what we call Jewish towns, what made them so is not only that they were the most characteristic form of Jewish settlement, but also because Jews made up such a large proportion of the town's population. So my father's town of Apatov was 60% or more were Jewish, but you had some towns who were up to 90% Jewish, 70%, 80%, even cities, Białystok, 50 to 70%. So that critical mass made for a very integral Jewish way of life, but it gave these towns their very, very special character. So this, we're going to come back to this gallery, this 18th century gallery about the Jewish town, which was our way of really zooming in and focusing on the everyday life of ordinary people in the places where they lived and formed this very unique way of life. Then we move to the 19th century when this enormous Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is partitioned by the Russian Empire, the Austrian Empire, and the Kingdom of Prussia. We refer to it as the long 19th century. It begins in the 1770s, 90s, and then it doesn't end until World War I. And essentially, the Commonwealth, and that means also Poland, disappear from the face of the map. But it's like a palimpsest for the purpose of the exhibition. That map of the Commonwealth kind of lies underneath the partitions. And we have a really interesting way of being able to present Jewish life in those territories. Then the interwar years after World War I. So we're now in the 20s and 30s, the Holocaust, and then finally the post-war period. And we are just now in the midst of creating a wonderful if you will, epilogue to the whole core exhibition and the central circulation space that will be looking at what Polish Jews took with them, those who left, because most Jews who have a history with Poland, in fact, are not living in Poland today. Millions of them are living all over the world, and we tell their story. Now, what was it? Well, first of all, how did Event Communications imagine this, what we're calling the Jewish Town Gallery? How did they imagine it when they were doing the master plan? So before there was a building, etc. So here's how they imagined it. So first of all, the idea was that they would find a way to build. They would either go to a theater prop maker, or they would find someone to fabricate the ceiling and probably upper women's galleries or level of a wooden synagogue. And I'm not sure where they took this from, and clearly it makes no reference to the painted interior, but be that as it may. And that under the synagogue and all around it would be large projections of economic life, daily life, essentially the shtetl. But as you can probably tell from this photograph, all those projections are from photographs from the 1920s and 30s, and we are in the 18th century. So we had a set of principles that we used in creating the whole exhibition, and that is to say, when you are in a particular historical period, all of the source material, every shred of it, is from the period. And even if, in the case of the medieval period, all you've got are tombstones and coins, so be it. We don't actually take material from later and use it, whether it's texts, sources, images, objects, whatever it might be. So that was out of the question, and that's first of all. But the second was the relationship of the elements. And this was not a way that we had in mind to work. So to be fair, this is the master plan. This was created between 2000 and 2004. This was created before there was any kind of architecture, but nonetheless, conceptually, it is the opposite of the way in which we chose to work. So what did we want to communicate? We wanted to communicate that these Jewish towns were the economic hubs in a vast agricultural country, and that they were the economic hubs of the huge, enormous estates of the nobility, that the nobility created private towns in order to economically develop their estates, and they invited Jews to settle in these towns because they were literate, they could run business, they know how to keep accounts, and they were good managers. So we wanted to communicate that, and we have these incredible watercolor landscapes of one of the great latifundia by a painter named Münz, created at the end of the 18th century. The nobleman wanted to record, I think he must have felt the end coming on, and he wanted to record everything that was going on in his estate. And so we created a very, very beautiful, enormous panorama to create, using sources from the period, to create this huge rolling rural landscape and this agricultural setting for this urban hub, for this economic hub. And as a result, our historian for this particular gallery, our lead historian, was Adam Teller. The first thing he said was that he didn't want the synagogue to overwhelm the whole story, number one. And number two, he said we have to separate the market and the economic story from the synagogue and the story of everyday Jewish life, religious movements, that these should be the two, if you will, centers of gravity of this gallery, and they should be put into the right relation. And so that's exactly what we did. We created, and it's a very beautiful, I would say, an evocation. We never do any kind of literal recreation, but we do take poetic license, and we do create an evocative setting within which we embed whatever messages, stories that we want to tell. And so this is the, if you will, the center of gravity that is the marketplace. But this is a history museum. This is a multimedia narrative museum. And what we also wanted to communicate is that this is not like the ethnographic present, a kind of unchanging, isolated Jewish oasis in the midst of a sea of others. We wanted to communicate that this is that even when we are presenting everyday life in the so-called Jewish town, that there are all kinds of new things happening. So that after a century of war, the 17th century in Poland was devastating. It was not only devastating for Jews because of the Cossack uprising, but it was also devastating for the entire Commonwealth because of the Swedish wars and other wars. And so there was, coming out of that period towards the end of the 17th century, the Commonwealth, that is to say, basically this territory rebounded economically. But it was also a period, from a Jewish perspective, of spiritual yearning. And we have the emergence of new religious developments, new religious movements. And so what we did is we encircled the synagogue with these new developments. And so, for example, the rise of Hasidism. So the story of the Baal Shem Tov, which is an 18th century story, which we then continue in the 19th century gallery, or the story of the Vilna Gaon also starts in the 18th century, and the development of the modern yeshiva. And also the story of Mendel Levin and the beginnings of the Jewish Enlightenment in Poland, the Haskalah in Poland, and also heretics. So we are probably the only museum that presents Jewish history that has a church. And actually, one of my Christian colleagues said to me, but how will anybody know it's a church? I said, what do you mean? It's obviously a church. He said, but there's no cross. I said, I can't go that far. So it's a church without a cross. So, but what we did, which I think is really, well, we had to figure out what to do. What are we going to do with Jacob Frank? So Jacob Frank is one of, and it's a whole phenomenon of, if you will, false messiahs, basically. And we wanted to tell his story. It's a really incredibly interesting story. And we felt that it was part of this, if you will, panorama or spectrum of new religious movements, including ones that are heretical. And we thought that because he tried to put his position forward in debates that were adjudicated by the church, we'd put him in a church and tell his story in a church, and you would be able to sit on pews. But in fact, the real gist, the real point of this particular installation is to explore the changing relationship of church and the Jews. Okay, so the time came to figure out what to do about the synagogue. So we know what Event had in mind. It was this very strange, I don't know what it is, a wooden ceiling of some kind, and maybe part of the interior. And we were in a quandary. It was 2007, and Michael Berkowitz, who was a great supporter and was very active in helping the museum, he called me up. He said, "Look, you're in New York for a couple of days from Warsaw. You have to meet two people. You have to meet Rick and Laura Brown, who have a nonprofit educational organization called Hands House." And I said, "I don't have time. I'm only here for 5 days. I don't have time. I don't." He says, "No, I absolutely insist." So we met at what used to be Oliver Shalom, what used to be Angelica. It was a little bakery coffee shop on the corner of Bleecker and Broadway. And I remember it like it was yesterday, sitting at a little table, the four of us, with a little laptop. And they showed me like a 7-minute version of how they made the bima of the Gvozdzets synagogue, a 7-minute video. And I said, "What?" They took a bunch of their students from Mass Arts because they are themselves sculptors, but they're also educators. And they have the most wonderful pedagogy ever, the gold standard. And they showed me this video. And what did they show me? They showed me that they took these students and using traditional tools, traditional materials, traditional techniques, and the source material, which is to say, photographs by Alois Breyer, I'll tell you more about him, and his drawings, and his color rendition. They used that information, and in 1 week, they created the bima. So I said, okay, so what's going on here? So what's their mission? Their mission is to recover lost objects. Okay, to recover lost objects. What they say is you can never recover an object, a lost object, in terms of what it was made of. In other words, you can never recover it in terms of its, quote, its, if you will, its, I'd call it its first iteration, maybe a way to think about it that way. I don't even want to call it the original one. The first one, let's call it the first one. In terms of the first substance, what I would call the oneness of substance. You can't do that, but you can do something else. And that is, you can recover the knowledge of how to make it. And that, they say, has enormous, enormous value. And in order to recover the knowledge for how to make it, you have to make it. And you have to make it using traditional tools, materials, and techniques. So I was smitten. I mean, this was love at first sight. I said, absolutely, we have to do it. Now, the way that they work is that they gather all the resource material they can find and they make a scale model. This is the beginning of the scale model of the Gvozdzets wooden synagogue. Now, why this particular synagogue, I'll explain in just a moment. But I want to go to the heart of what I'm thinking about here in terms of materializing history. And that is, and I don't think they were thinking about this at all, but when I found this, I said to myself, all right, we are in new territory here. This is a shrine in Japan that is more than or approximately 1,500 years old, but never more than 20 years old. Why? Because every 20 years they tear it down, so they have to rebuild it. Why? Because they value the knowledge of how to build it more than the materials out of which it was made. In other words, here's a material object whose ultimate value is intangible. It's tangible, but its value, what is most valuable about it, is intangible, which is why you have to demolish it and rebuild it, because the only way, from their perspective, from this Japanese perspective, the only way to transmit the knowledge, because the knowledge is embodied. You're not reading a recipe. You're not reading an instruction book. you are transmitting embodied knowledge with traditional tools, materials, and techniques. And so the Jingju Shrine, I think this is perfect. Now, what I love about it also is that, because you may be familiar with the ship of Theseus. So the ship of Theseus is basically a story, and this is, of course, from antiquity, the story of a ship that's out to sea, and every time something breaks, they have to replace a part. And they replace another part, they replace another part. And years later, there's none of the original material is left. And the philosophers have been chewing over this paradox for millennia. And they keep on asking themselves, is it still the same ship? Now, when I was an undergraduate at the University of Toronto in philosophy, I never heard of the ship of Theseus or the Theseus paradox. We called it Cutler's sock. So Mr. Cutler had a sock, and he kept on repairing it. And then finally, all the original wool was gone. Is it still Cutler's sock? That was the paradox. In my humble opinion, the Jingju Shrine makes that paradox moot. It just doesn't matter. From the point of view of the shrine and from the point of view of Gvozdyets, the whole issue is not about the original material, not about the, if you will, substance number one, the first iteration. So now let's go to the process, because I have to tell you, it wasn't easy to get everybody on board to go with this way. Well, I'll explain to you in a moment. So the first thing is the real inspiration for these for studying these wooden synagogues and for everything that we've done with them is Maria and Kazimierz Piechotka. She died recently, but she was an incredibly inspiring figure. Both of them Catholic, both of them architects and architectural historians who became very, very interested in wooden synagogues after the war. And they were with the Polish resistance during the war. And they published a book, very unusual. Under communism. I don't know how this happened, of course, on bad paper, etc. But anyway, they published it first in Polish and then in English. And incidentally, Richard Meyer gave a copy of the English book to Frank Stella when he was in the hospital. And it was the inspiration for Stella's Polish Village series, which we'll say more about in a moment also. So this book was really extraordinary, and it included, it went basically, and why Frank called it the Polish Village series is because the book was organized town by town by town by town, and for each town there was a photograph or photographs and their architectural drawings reconstructing everything inside based on documents. Now, they were continuing the work of Shimon Zaitchik, who was a wonderful architectural historian and pioneer in creating documenting wooden synagogues, and who was, of course, murdered during the Holocaust. So they really felt that they were carrying on the legacy of these pre-war historians and people interested in heritage buildings. Now, there were hundreds of wooden synagogues throughout Poland, throughout the Commonwealth, in fact, in Lithuania, Ukraine, Belarus also. And these synagogues, by the end of the war, not one was left standing. Not one. Now, some of them had been burned to the ground by the Russians during World War I. Gvozdyets is a case in point. And the others, and we even have a photograph of the Germans burning one down during the Holocaust. None of them have survived, but they are a treasure of Jewish material culture, and they date the ones that we can date from 1640s, but from the 17th century. But we know that some of them really date from the 16th century, and many of them also from the early 18th. But that is, in a sense, the golden age of these wooden synagogues. This is obviously from a glass plate, but sometimes, well, this I think is spectacular from the outside, but this is the Volpa synagogue, but also from the inside. They're incredible. And so they are obviously a collaboration between, if you will, local craftsmen. It might be Ukrainian, Belarusian, Polish, Lithuanian craftsmen, and who do the rough work on the outside, but Jewish carvers who would carve the Torah Ark and do all the painting on the inside. So here's one from Suchavoa. And let me see, yes. And then here's another, and I'll just give you a sense of them. This is, on this one, the Nazis burnt it to the ground. And here is the interior to give you a sense of it. And in fact, all we have are black and white photographs, except for those rare moments where we have something in color that gives us a sense of the palette. And we have here another one. And in this case, which is really, this is Yabuanov, I think, what's incredible about this one is that we also have a painting of the interior. And is a painting by Isidor Kaufmann, who was an artist working in Vienna, and who would spend months, particularly in the summer, in Galicia, which is the Austrian partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And he would write letters home to his wife, extolling how beautiful these synagogues are. And he called Galicia his promised land. That's how he referred to this territory. And then he would come back to Vienna, and in his studio, he would make the paintings. So, but this is, and he also did a painting of the interior of the Gvozdet synagogue, which I'll show you in a moment. And so this is the synagogue in Gombin, where it's actually got these two kind of onion forms on the front. Grodno, Mogilev, Jedwabne, and Zabudov. Now, Zabudov is amazing, and actually Hans Houses made a scale model of Zabudov. They also made it to scale, 100% scale of the door. I mean, they're fiends when it comes to trying to really understand these structures and to work on them as models and also full scale. But here you can see it's one of the oldest ones. You can see the inside with the bima. And here you can see, and this I think is quite extraordinary, but the end of September 1939, a photograph was taken of representatives of the Jewish community talking to a German soldier under the roof of the historic bima before the Soviet authorities occupied the city. And the bima itself had two vestibules with stairs, but when the Germans re-entered Zabudov, pushing the Soviets out in 1941, they burned the synagogue to the ground. So this gives you a sense of where, what happened with these synagogues. So we come to Gvozdet. So in talking with Hans Haus, and in talking with him in 2007 at Angelica, at the little table with a cup of coffee, which synagogue should be the one for our museum? And they said, without missing a beat, Gvozdet. And why? Even though the Russians burnt it to the ground, or it caught on fire during the Russian front moving through Gvozdet during World War I, they said it's the single best documented of all the wooden synagogues. It's incredibly, incredibly well documented. And so they said that's the one. And I think because it was so well documented, Thomas Hubka, who's an architectural historian, wrote an entire monograph, large format, which has just been reprinted, which takes all the documentation he could find. And he basically created this monograph, which is the only book of its kind on a wooden synagogue. So what does the documentation look like? So from the early 1890s, Mashkovsky, who did his doctoral dissertation on Gvozdet, and he went from Warsaw. Well, actually, he was in Lviv, but he went several times over the course of the 90s, and he documented. He made drawings, and this is wonderful because it actually shows you people in the image. He made also drawings of the inside, and so he left us a treasure. We have his whole dissertation handwritten. So we have a real, that's the earliest documentation we have for Gvozdet. The next is from basically from a wonderful historian, and that is from Alois Breyer. Alois Breyer, between 1910 and 1913, it was the last breath just before the synagogue was burnt to the ground, he did his doctoral dissertation on this synagogue as well. And he traveled throughout Galicia to document wooden synagogues, but he devoted most of his energy and most of his photographs and his drawings specifically to this synagogue, and then published the results in a book, in a co-authored book. But here are some of the materials that we have from him. So, for example, this is a cutaway that really shows you the ceiling and the internal structure of the roof. When Frank Stella came to the exhibition that we did of his paintings in relation to the synagogues, I asked him what impressed him, and I said to him, you know, you've never actually seen one in 3 dimensions. I want to show you the one in the core exhibition. So I brought him into the core exhibition. I showed it to him, and of course, the painted ceiling is so spectacular. Oh, he said, I'm not interested in that. He said, I'm interested in the timber framing. I'm interested in that wooden structure. That's what interests me, not the painted ceiling. So here you have this is the documentation, and documenting also the timber framing. And of course, Hans House also did research trips with several students and colleagues to document examples that are alive and well today of shingling, timber framing in historic buildings, churches, barns, workshops, and the like. And here you have on the left, you have a Breuer photograph, but on the right, you have an Isidor Kaufmann painting of the interior of the Gwoździec synagogue. He calls it the Rabbi's Portal, which gives us a color reference. And we also have, thanks to Breuer, we have a color study. This is actually this is a color rendering of his original color study from early 1914. So these are the materials we had to work with, and is why we chose Gwoździec. Now, oh, that's great. We can make all kinds of plans sitting, in a cafe, but you have to go back to Warsaw. And I go back to Warsaw, and the director of the time, Jerzy Halberstadt, who is really a visionary and was incredible. I personally found it a really incredible experience to work with him because he was so open and generally very, very open, but not to this. He said no. So I said, why? He said, you can't do it. It's impossible. How are you going to do it? Number one. Number two, it's going to take too long. Number three, it's going to cost too much. And number four, I don't see the point. So that was the first hurdle. So I said, well, let me try and explain it to you. And of course, explaining. And I said to him, if I can find the money for it, what about that? So he figured it'll cost so much, the chances of me finding any money for it are nil. So it'll be dead on arrival. We don't have to worry about it. Okay, so then after it persisting, the our project manager, Robert Supel, came from the corporate world to be a project manager at the museum. And he decided he needed to up his game, and he took a course in the managing of cultural institutions. And he made his project, when he had to graduate from this course, he made his project a business plan for this project. So now I had and in the process of doing it, he got completely with the program. So now I had Robert, and finally, I think Jerzy thought, okay, she's never going to raise the money, so I don't have to worry about that. So now let's demonstrate that it's impossible. So he said, you know what? I will pay for you and Robert and Hans House, meaning Laura and Rick Brown, and Robert will drive you all over Poland, and you will go to all these different synagogues where you say you want to do these workshops, 12 workshops, and you'll see that they don't want to host you. So we said, okay, we'll do it. So where did we go? Well, we went to Sena, to the White Synagogue. We went to Zamość, to this incredible Renaissance synagogue in the south of Poland. We went to Rzeszów. We went to Szczebrzeszyn. We went to the White Stork Synagogue. They all said yes. So, and what did that mean? Because what these are masonry synagogues, because they're still standing, that have been renovated and have been converted for the most part into a museum, a cultural center, an art museum, something like that. So this was sort of within the realm of possibility. So we came back and they said yes. And the next step, of course, was to find the funds. Now, I have to say that how Hans House managed to organize logistically a project of this complexity is miraculous in my view. 350 people participated, 350 students, timber framers, conservationists, scholars, 350 people, 12 workshops, 3 in the south of Poland, which I'll show you in a moment, and the others 2-week workshops with approximately 20 people each in each of these synagogues. And so, and in parts. Okay, so let's have a look and see where and how this project is going to sit inside the exhibition. So this became basically the floor plan for this half of the Jewish Town Gallery, the half that would be organized around the synagogue. And this is basically what it looks like. And there are no this element actually is suspended. It's not standing on pillars or on walls or anything of the kind. So I thought my problems were over, but they weren't, because Hans House said, why stop with the ceiling? Why not also do the roof? So it was still time, there was still time to say to the architect, can you make an opening in the ceiling so we can have the roof and it will come up out of the gallery and into the main hall, so that visitors who are on the main hall can actually look down and see into the timber framing, which they wouldn't be able to see from the lower level. And the architect said yes. And so now we were going to have not only this incredible painted ceiling, but also the timber framed roof. So the process begins. And it begins at the Folk Architecture Museum in Sanok in the south of Poland. And here we made common cause with one of their main staff, and they gave us permission to use a whole patch of their area to actually do the timber framing. And that meant gathering the 200 raw logs with the bark still on and bringing timber framers from across Europe and North America who are absolute fiends when it comes to using traditional adzes and pit saws and lathes and axes and you name it. And they brought their equipment in ski bags, and in how they got them through the airline, I have no idea, but they're absolutely they're so passionate about working with traditional tools. And they proceeded to strip the logs, make the planks, and train these young students who had never picked up a hammer or a screwdriver how to use an 18th or 17th century lathe. And you get a sense of it here. And in three 2-week workshops, basically, we completed the timber framing, and we then had the basic structure for the synagogue, roof and ceiling, but we were 2 years from opening. So it's all put together with wooden pegs. So it's like a puzzle. And so what they did was they removed the pegs, they numbered all the parts, they laid everything under a tarpaulin, and they left it there for 2 years until we were ready to bring all the parts to Warsaw. In the meantime, in each of 2 summers, 2011, 2012, we ran the painting workshops in the synagogues. And so you get a sense here of what a painting workshop looked like in the White Stork Synagogue in Wrocław, and the creating of pigments from the original source pigment materials, including a very rare one for blue using woad, which you don't really hear or see anything about today. And these are some of these are people with experience, but a lot of these students had never picked up a paintbrush before, and they did all of the work. And what did they work from? They worked from Mashkovsky's 1890s drawings. They worked from Breyer's photographs and drawings from 1913, 14, and they produced these painted panels. They did this. This is also the White Stork Synagogue. This would be the Kupa Synagogue in Krakow. This would be the High Synagogue. And here are some of the panels, and they gathered together, and we were very, very thrilled that that we could all be together for a photograph. But this will give you an idea of some of the paintings that were done in these workshops. And my personal favorite are the bunnies. What can I tell you? I have a particular affection for the bunnies. But this is the photograph that is for me the most important, because this is Maria Piechotka could be there, and she could actually be there not only when we had prepared the painted panels, but she could be there when we had brought all the wooden parts from Sanok, assembled them, and she could be there and see the whole assembly. And that included putting these panels in place, which was a whole other very complicated process, and then hoisting this 25-ton structure. And she got to help hoist the structure, which was, we just thought that was totally amazing. And to then give us, a short speech about this particular synagogue and its importance. And so this gives you a little bit of a sense of what was going on. Now, this is the last part of the story, but I thought my problems were over, but they weren't. Because, okay, it was going to be the ceiling. Then it was going to be the ceiling and the roof. But I wanted the bima too. And what was the problem with the bima? The synagogue ceiling and roof are 85% scale. The bima, which was created in Massachusetts, where Hand House has its studio, in that week in 2007, is 100% scale. So that's the first problem. I didn't think it was a problem. And it is in Massachusetts. It had to be, and it wasn't painted yet, and it had to be brought to Warsaw. And it, and the question is, so there was a lot of resistance. No, everything's wrong with it. It's 100% scale. No. It's going to make everything crowded. No. It's going to obscure the ceiling, the beautiful ceiling. We just want to contemplate the ceiling. I said, have you seen the top of the bima? It's like a few curvy pieces like this. It's like a net. You can see right through it, up, and which is how people in Gwoździec experienced it. Not a problem. Well, in the original synagogue, the bima was not in the center of the space. It was closer to the steps to the Holy Ark, to the Yom Kodesh. So it was actually not at the center, but we couldn't do that because it was too big. So it needed to be in the center. So they were all arguing about, really going to put it in the center, etc. So finally, they said, okay. So the bima was disassembled. It was brought to Warsaw. And we had another painting workshop, this time in Warsaw. And we painted it in a workshop just as we had painted everything else. And then we installed it in the under the ceiling. And this is the ensemble as it looks today. And then with all of the elements in place. And one of my favorite images is we have kids that come, and they all come with a little cushion that's like a backpack, and they walk around the museum like a little turtle with these backpacks. But when they come to Gwoździec, they just lie down and they contemplate the ceiling. And one of the young men, a Polish student that was working on the project, because Hans House made a marvelous film called Raise the Roof, which I think many of you have already seen. But he said that what's important to him is that when he gets married and has a child, and he brings this child to the museum, he will bring this child to Gwoździec, and he will point and he will say, your daddy helped to make that. And he was really, it was so deeply moving for him. Now, there was one last thing. I mean, there's always like a last thing, but then there's another last thing. And this was on the upper level, because at the lower level, we didn't want to provide the whole story because we wanted to keep our visitors inside the period and in the 18th century, and only with sources that, obviously we used these later documentation. So we thought, you know what we'll do? You can see the timber framed roof because it's come up into the main floor. We're going to create a glass ledge all the way around. And on that glass ledge, we're going to provide all the documentation about wooden synagogues, about this particular one, about the people who documented them, about how we made it. And we provided a map showing where they are. And you've got a kid who's actually looking to see if there was one in his town. So even a graphic map was really meaningful. And then most recently, it was a thrill to be able to create an exhibition that brought together Frank Stella's Polish Village series and the original documentation on which the Piechotkas had actually based their book. And so it was, and in this photograph, you can see Maria Piechotka and Marian Tursky, who passed away 30 days ago. I think today might be the 30th, his shloshim, his 30th day, who was a wonderful, most inspiring person. So with that, I'll conclude, and I'm happy to take questions.
Oh, we have a
Yes,
question
please.
up here.
Oh, sorry, I've got Andrew.
Let me just give you a mic.
I just want to ask, first of all, thank you for that incredible spectrum exposition. Thank you. Um, who were the people who actually did the painting and the woodwork? Were they from Poland? Were they from here? Were they Jewish? Were they not Jewish?
Do you mean originally or now?
No, what you showed
Now.
us.
Okay. They were from, first of all, a lot of them were students that had studied with Hanshaus, with Rick and Laura Brown from Mass Arts. But they came from Canada, they came from across the US, they came from Europe. I think also there are ones from Israel, a lot of them from Poland. And they were not only students, there were also master craftsmen, heritage specialists, conservators, like really a broad range. And something that I wanted to actually stress, which I think is terribly important about how this synagogue functions within the core exhibition, and that is that it exemplifies the message we want to communicate, which is that it is categorically Jewish, but distinctly Polish, Ukrainian, Lithuanian, Belarusian, Latvian, and that relationship, which we can see very strongly in many aspects of it, is extremely very important for us. Also, to say that the that it's different from the Jingju Shrine. It's different because there, the archive is in the body of the builders. That's where the archive is. Here, the archive was created from a direct relationship with the first iteration of the synagogue. And what this project did was to work from that documentation and work from it in a way that would, in a sense, uncover or generate new knowledge that could only be generated through the process of making it. So you had to, in a sense, it looks like we set out to make it. Well, we sort of did, but it looks like we set out to make it. But the making of it is the result of a process of discovering the knowledge. So it has that kind of complexity, which is really different from the ship of Theseus, is how I put it.
Barbara, in thinking about, however, the shrine, the Japanese shrine, do you imagine tearing this down and rebuilding it?
But I had enough trouble getting it built. And I think it's very durable. I do think it's durable. And I'll tell you what else is interesting, and that is that the most durable and the most memorable elements in this multimedia narrative exhibition are not multimedia. they're what I call analog. They just um, they're um, they just are, and they're not digital. Let me put it that way. And the other thing is that I refuse to refer to Gwoździec as reproduction, reconstruction, copy, facsimile, and I never refer to it as virtual because I consider it actual. So it's, I think it really puts pressure on the way that we think about materiality, the way that we think about, quote, materializing history and what the process of materializing can yield. So, although it could yield a lot, I don't know how much we would learn by destroying it and building it again. I don't think so.
Thanks, Barbara. I was formulating a kind of analog to that question that has to do with the fact that now it's a museum's object. It's a museum object. And how do you, going forward, how will the museum, how might the museum prevent its ossification as a museum prop, as a museum artifact, given the life and livelihood of the story you told? And the second part of my question is, has it triggered interest outside the museum in doing the work of recreation locally in other places?
Okay, so I actually have another whole chapter on this topic, which has to do with what happened afterwards. So in Sanok, in this folk architecture museum, they were inspired by this to actually reconstruct a wooden synagogue from another location and to incorporate it into their reconstructed 19th century Galician town square. So that would be one case. A second case is in Bilgerai, which is the hometown of Isaac Bashevis Singer. And there's a foundation that was created to create a kind of Jewish, not even, no, I would say multi-ethnic street with a church to reflect Ruthenian, Tatar, Polish, and Jewish presence in the town. And although it's Bilgerai and Volpa is, I don't know how many hundreds of kilometers away, they thought Volpa was a beautiful synagogue, so why not reconstruct it in Bilgerai? So, and they see this as commercial tourism, hotels, festivals, culture, etc. So that would be a second one. The third one, which I find very interesting, is for Gombin. So in the case of Gombin, what's so interesting about it is that Jews who left Gombin during the period of mass immigration, like the 1880s to 1920s, mainly to World War I, they formed a Landsmannschaft, a hometown society. And then as those old timers died, that Landsmannschaft kind of, like many of the other ones, it just basically dissolved. But a new generation in the 90s revived it as a Gombin Jewish Historical Genealogical Society, but basically on the basis of the old Landsmannschaft. And they decided what they wanted to do was to encourage their children and grandchildren to feel a deep connection to this town. And they actually, some Gombiners made trips to Gombin during the 30s with a movie camera. And they were so proud of the synagogue that they actually filmed the synagogue. And we have photographs of the synagogue as well. It's the one with the two onions. It's very distinctive. So they decided, and they make a pilgrimage every year to the town, and they've made common cause with local people, and they've done a lot. They decided that they wanted to make the ultimate scale model of the Gombin synagogue. And they took a completely different approach. It's almost, well, ghostly isn't fair, because, and I mean it in the most positive, I really mean it in a positive way. It's white, no color. It doesn't try to imitate wood. It's just pristine white. But they also made a very technologically sophisticated VR model of the synagogue inside and out. Then they made common cause with the State Ethnographic Museum in Warsaw, whose director at the time, his grandmother was from Gombin, helps. and who created some, it's an ethnographic museum, so it's got material from all over the world, but didn't have nothing Jewish. So he created a Jewish annex or Jewish corner, so to speak. And the centerpiece is the scale model of the Gombin wooden synagogue. So those would be some examples.
Question back here.
Yeah.
Barbara, that was wonderful. So I have a question. First of all, it's great to hear about this process of what at BGC we might call historical archaeology. I don't know whether you would agree with that term, but it's a lot of us think about recreation or reconstruction as a form of research, which is what you were thinking about, and the purpose of that. But I wonder what you imagine current Polish kids and people visiting, what they think when they see this amazing object, what you first of all, what you want them to think and what they do think, if you have any idea.
I think it's a good question. I think generally everybody is surprised. I think that they're surprised and deeply moved. I think generally that's the response is, oh my God, this is incredible. This is amazing. This is so beautiful. So I think generally that's the first response. Then I think there's curiosity about what does everything stand for? Zodiac signs. Jews had zodiac signs in their synagogues. All those animals, the bull, the leviathan, those the cherubim, all those. They're curious. They wanna know what it all stands for. So, and we have essentially lecterns. We provide the whole synagogue ceiling with glosses on anything they might want to know about any of the elements on the ceiling itself. I think that, I think for many people, the only images they have of East European Jewish life are black and white photographs. And most of the black and white photographs they've been exposed to, which is really a fraction of what's out there, represent this world as poor, pious, and persecuted. And so the idea that this is a world in living color, because even the tombstones were painted in bright colors with gold letters, which comes as a total surprise. So the idea that this is a world in color, I think also they're surprised because they all have bought the, I would say they've bought the second commandment that Jews don't have any visual culture because they're forbidden to make images, which is absolutely not the case. And the evidence, this is evidence to the contrary, but there's more evidence. So I think they're surprised at the richness of Jewish visual culture. They're surprised at the color. And I think that, one of the things we try to do is we actually, and this is another hurdle I still have 10 years later to overcome. It's my next project. And that is that we commissioned a wonderful historian of Ashkenazi liturgical music to compose a score for this space that would resonate with what she could reconstruct as a kind of 18th century everyday sound in the synagogue. And I was never able to get the museum to install it. But that's my next, I have a few other little projects in that space, but that's my next project, is to get that sound installed. And it's not cantorial. It's rather everyday, like ordinary people reading from the Torah or praying, whatever it might be. And she is a very contemporary composer. So it's not literal. So I think, our Polish visitors, in the beginning, I used to say they're more interested in Judaism than in Jews. That was always my worry. And that I wanted and I hoped that the museum would shift, or at least, in a sense, surprise them with the richness of the story that we would tell. And I think that here's a case where, yes, it is dealing with religious life, but it has so many other dimensions to it. So I think that would be, and I think Jews are amazed. A lot of people say, I just had no idea. We had no idea. It comes as a total surprise.
Um, oh, sorry. I just wanted to thank you firstly for taking us so fully into your process, because it's very inspiring, and I feel like it's going to keep sparking things for months. So thank you. My question has shifted so much since I heard you answering the last one. So I was thinking about how you were speaking on sort of these different, like, wanting people to feel themselves in the 17th century or the 18th century, for example, and really feel that they are in that period or experiencing that. And so firstly, I was curious how you sort of conceived of making that happen in the museum space, and then how it's actually been, how you've seen people, whether it feels like they are experiencing it the way that you intended them to. And then in lieu of your answer just now, I'm just thinking a lot about how you're talking about this kind of like not recreation, but like igniting of a process or a way. Um, and I'm curious about how you think of those two things sort of together.
Sure. So, yes, we like to work in a way that's evocative and not literally recreate. And I don't consider Gwoździec a quote literal recreation, as you know. As for how do we keep our, or how do we, what are we trying to achieve by keeping our visitors in the moment, and how do we do it, and is it successful? That I think is the essence of your question. So, one of the ways that we do it is by staying in what we call the historical present and narrating in the first person. So it means that we don't we try to provide a way for the visitor to keep a very narrow horizon forward, like the people in our story, without anticipating usually the Holocaust. But at least, and for, I mean, because they don't know what happened between then and the Holocaust usually. So if they're going to leap forward, it's going to be all the way to the end. So it's very important for us to keep, in a sense, by only using sources from the period, by only referring to what is happening in the period. That's the starting point. The second is that we narrate through first person primary sources, and that's had a mixed reception, to be honest. It's for us, it's a play script, literally a play script in our theater of history. But for some people, it's confusing because they're expecting to have a historian or a curator or a narrator give them a clearer story, and not have to, in a sense, put it together from the play script that we have provided. We do provide our explanation, narration, commentary. We do, but it's not the primary way that we drive the story. And also, for example, in this particular gallery, there's no particular order. You can go in any order you want. You don't have to go in a particular order. And the intention, especially in this gallery, is for the visitor to take a more exploratory approach rather than try to follow a prescribed path. So I would say, in terms of success, probably mixed. And would we do it differently if we were to do it again? I don't know. I have to think about it.
Okay. Thank you very much. Just seeing that photograph of Marian Tursky, who you said passed away 30 days ago, just reminds us that there still is today a Jewish community in Poland, and so this 1,000-year history of Polish Jews is actually continuing. It didn't come to an end, and we think there's anywhere between 15,000 and 30,000 Jews in Poland today. My question to you is, in the decade of the history of this museum, what reaction have you gotten from Jews who were born and raised and live in Poland today? And if you could comment on that.
Sure. No, thank you very much for making that point. I would say that this museum is part of their history. In other words, I see that on the one hand, I argue this is not a Jewish museum, and I get a lot of pushback. I say it's not a Jewish museum. It is an institution of public history, and it's yes, key people who were responsible for creating it were Jewish. Key people who were responsible for supporting it, and I should say that we could never ever have created Gwozdets without the generous support of Irene Pletka, who immediately understood how important this is. And she said, even I, she said, a Bundist, a secularist, my father would turn in his grave. Even I can see how incredible, what a work of art this is, and I will support it. So, yes, we have Jewish benefactors, we've had Jewish prime movers, but our team is a mixture of Jews and non-Jews. But I see this as I don't see it as a Jewish museum, but I see it as part of the history of the post-war history of Polish Jews. And most important, I see it as a resource for the renewal of Jewish life in Poland, as being this rich resource for a kind of a bottomless well of knowledge for the renewal of Jewish life, and as an inspiration, as an affirmation, and as an agent, really, as an agent in kind of a transformative agent in Poland generally, and for Jews living in Poland, and I hope also beyond.
We have a question up here. Would you pass that? Hey, Howard. Let's see. You seem to be a woman who likes the word no so that you can get the job done. It was a wonderful presentation. I wondered, in many of the synagogues that are presently in service today, you mentioned that they were not in service for religious reasons. They were mostly museums, historical places. Do any of them have religious
Oh,
participation?
absolutely. Oh, yes, for sure. So first of all, the Nozick Synagogue in Warsaw survived, and it's active, and it is the synagogue of the chief rabbi, Michael Shudrick, the chief rabbi of Poland. So the Nozick Synagogue is definitely functioning. Then, in terms of historical synagogues, there are several in Krakow, specifically the Temple Synagogue is functioning, and the Ramu Synagogue, the small, very, very old Ramu Synagogue with a cemetery, it's still functioning as well. But there are many, many synagogues that are not used in what I think of appropriate ways. And there's a wonderful photographer, Vilcik Wojcik, who had a photographic project called There's No Such Thing as an Innocent Eye. And what he did was he simply went around the country and took photographs of former synagogues as if he were a real estate agent. You know how those real estate photographs, they're square and they're just frontal like this? They're just straight on. Hundreds of them. And many of them you would never know they had been a synagogue. They were a furniture factory, they were a movie house, they were a cafe, they were used for, and often the exteriors were completely transformed. Others were used as an archive, a library, but it's a feature. I would say that these synagogues, whether they're used, whether they're ruins, whether they're used inappropriately, those synagogues and the cemeteries are part of a post-genocide landscape, basically, which I'm going to talk about next week.
I have one more question. I think it is remarkable that you put together with a team what turned out to be a guild of craftspeople who can now go on and do historical restorations as a group if they choose anywhere in the world. I hope you seem to have other projects planned.
Yes, but also I have to really say that the real prime movers in this is Hans House, is Laura and Rick Brown, and they're the ones who have this incredible pedagogy. And if it's not a synagogue, then they actually did a section of the Notre Dame destroyed roof was one of their more recent projects. So they're, and you can really see they're just so inspired. You can really see who they are, what they stand for from the film Raise the Roof. It really, I think, really conveys. And so they I have to really give them credit.
When that thema was taken apart for 2 years.
The synagogue. The synagogue.
When it was dismantled from the pegs and it sat for 2 years, did you have any trouble with expansion?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, they're twisting, and that meant also that all of those panels that were painted that had to be fit into the structure, it was really, really difficult. I mean, and they're perfectionists of the first order, and they're working with master craftsmen that are like, world class, top of the line. So, and the logistics of working with 350 people and 12 workshops, and then transporting all this stuff and everything, and watching them hoist it. I just marveled. So really and truly, they're the heroes. They are the heroes. Thank you. We have a question up here.
I've been staring at this photograph. Sorry, excuse me. I've been staring at this photograph, and it has a composition, brutalist, I think, in nature, but of this wood. What is it, and
Okay.
why is it there?
Okay, so this is so Stella says that in the early 70s, when he did his Polish Village series, which was, and the series, each, I think there are approximately 40 synagogues. Each one is identified by the town where the synagogue was. He said it was the first time where he didn't paint a painting, he constructed it. And that it was the first time that the painting, he still considered it a painting, came off the wall. So it was a decisive moment in the history of his work. But what we did in the exhibition, which you really can't see here, is that we presented not only the so-called finished painting, but we presented everything leading up to it, all of his maquettes, his drawings, everything to his process, together with the original archival material that the Piechotkas had printed in their book. Not photographs, not facsimiles, not scans, but actually from the archives in Warsaw. And so we juxtapose that original archival material with his process, with the final work. And it was a really wonderful exhibition.
I hope you'll all join us on April 10th for the final lecture in this series. But for now, please join me in thanking Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett.